March 17, 1944, 11:42 a.m. over the Ruhr Valley, Germany. Staff Sergeant Eddie Kowalski watched through the waist gun window as the B-17 to his right, Sally's Revenge, simply disintegrated, not from flak, not from fighters. The landing gear dropped mid-flight. The drag ripped the gear doors clean off. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into the bomb bay. And then the friction spark did what friction sparks do to aviation fuel vapor. The fireball consumed all 9 men in 2-3 seconds. It was the 4th crew that week, same way, every single time. Before we continue with Eddie's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now, back to March 1944, over Germany, where Eddie Kowalski was about to witness something that would haunt him and drive him to break every regulation in the manual. Eddie Kowalski was never supposed to be a flight engineer. At 5'6" and 142 pounds, the Army Air Forces initially rejected him twice for insufficient physical stature for flight crew duty. The third time, he lied about his hometown, changing it from the Polish neighborhood in South Chicago to Chicago proper, and added 2 inches to his height on the form. He was 23 years old. He'd been working at his uncle's machine shop since he was 14, rebuilding hydraulic systems for city buses and garbage trucks. He could diagnose a failed pressure valve by sound alone. What Eddie brought to the war was a mechanic's suspicion. If something breaks the same way more than twice, the design is broken, not the operators. Between January 15th and March 20th, 1944, 17 B-17s from the 301st Bomb Group exploded in mid-flight over Europe. Not from enemy action, from their own landing gear. The pattern was identical every time. Gear would deploy uncommanded during flight, create massive drag, rip the gear doors off, hydraulic fluid would spray into the bomb bay, a spark would ignite the vapor, and the aircraft would detonate. 17 planes, 153 men, all dead before they could bail out. The official explanation from Wright Field engineers was pilot error. Crews were supposedly bumping the gear lever during evasive maneuvers, but Eddie knew that was impossible. He'd flown 31 missions. He'd seen how pilots flew. Nobody was accidentally deploying landing gear at 23,000 feet while trying to dodge flak. His best friend saw it differently. Technical Sergeant Raymond Chen, engineer on Memphis Murder, had a theory. Chen was from Sacramento, 26 years old, the son of immigrants who ran a laundry service. Before the war, he'd rebuilt the hydraulic lift system for his father's pressing machines. Chen and Eddie had plans. After the war, they'd open a shop together, Kowalski and Chen Hydraulics 50-50 partnership. They shook hands on it in January 1944. The night before, Chen's crew flew a mission to Frankfurt. Chen noticed something nobody else had caught. Every single B-17 that exploded had recently undergone depot-level maintenance at Burtonwood. Every single one had been refitted with new hydraulic actuators, supposedly improved models with higher pressure ratings. But Chen suspected the higher pressure was causing a problem with the gear uplocks. He told Eddie about it on March 19th. On March 20th, Memphis Murder took a direct flak hit over Schweinfurt. The hit severed hydraulic lines, gear dropped, spray hit the hot metal from the flak burst. Raymond Chen and 8 other men became a cloud of aluminum confetti over Bavaria. Eddie didn't speak for 3 days. On the 4th day, he started examining his own aircraft's landing gear system, at night, without authorization, with a flashlight and a borrowed technical manual. What Eddie found made him furious. The new hydraulic actuators generated 200 psi, 400 psi higher than the system was designed for. The excess pressure was slowly deforming the uplock hooks. After enough flight cycles, the hooks would fail to fully engage, held only by hydraulic pressure. Any sudden pressure drop, from battle damage, from temperature change, from simple vibration, would cause the gear to fall. The planes weren't exploding because of pilots. They were exploding because some engineer at Wright Field had improved the system to death. But fixing it would require modifying aircraft systems without authorization. Court-martial offense. Eddie didn't care anymore. Chen was dead, and more crews would die unless someone did something. The solution was absurdly simple. Eddie needed to reduce the hydraulic pressure going to the gear actuators without reducing pressure to the rest of the system. He couldn't replace the actuators. That would require parts he didn't have and modifications that couldn't be hidden. But he could add a restrictor. In his uncle's machine shop, Eddie had built hundreds of pressure restrictors for hydraulic systems. You thread a precisely sized orifice into the line, it bleeds off excess pressure. The trick was sizing it correctly. Too small, gear won't deploy. Too large, problem persists. Eddie pulled the technical data for the original actuators. They operated at 800 psi. The new ones were running at 200. He needed to bleed off exactly 400 psi, but only in the gear circuit. He did the math on the back of a navigation log. Orifice diameter of 78 inches would create the restriction he needed at standard operating temperature. On March 24th, at 2:30 a.m., Eddie broke into the machine shop at Ridgewell Airfield. He had 40 minutes before the night guard made his rounds. He needed to manufacture 4 restrictors, one for each main gear actuator on his aircraft, Bourbon Street Brawler. He found a brass rod, the correct diameter, measured 4 lengths of exactly 2 inches, cut them on the lathe, threaded both ends with a die set. Then the critical part, drilling the center orifice. He had 1 chance per piece. Brass was too soft to survive a second drilling attempt. His hands were shaking. He thought about Chen. The shaking stopped. 47 minutes later, he had 4 perfect restrictors. The guard never came. Apparently he was asleep in the ready room. Installing them was the terrifying part. The hydraulic system had to be completely depressurized, which meant coordinating with the crew chief without explaining why. Eddie told him he was checking for leaks. The crew chief, a veteran master sergeant named Paulson, didn't ask questions. He'd lost friends too. Eddie worked alone in the wheel well. Each restrictor had to be threaded into the hydraulic line between the main pressure manifold and the gear actuator. The space was barely large enough for his hands. He worked by feel, threading the fittings finger-tight, then using a wrench for the final 3/4 turn. Exactly 3/4, over-tighten, and the brass would deform, under-tighten, and it would blow out under pressure. The 4th one wouldn't thread, cross-threaded. Eddie's stomach dropped. If he forced it, the threads would strip. If he removed it and tried again, he might not get another chance before daylight. He took a breath, backed it out slowly, felt for the start of the thread, tried again. This time it caught. 23 minutes later, all 4 restrictors were installed. Eddie repressurized the system, watching the gauge. Pressure climbed to 850 psi in the gear circuit. Perfect. The main system was still at 200. He'd done it. Now came the moment of truth, the pre-flight check. If the gear didn't deploy properly, the aircraft would be grounded. Eddie would have to explain the modifications, and he'd face a general court-martial for unauthorized modification of aircraft systems. If the gear deployed normally, he'd have to wait until combat to see if the restrictors prevented uncommanded deployment. March 25, 1944. Mission to Augsburg. Bourbon Street Brawler lifted off at 06:43 hours. Eddie sat at the engineer's station, watching the hydraulic pressure gauges like his life depended on it. Because it did. The mission was brutal. Heavy flak over the target. 2 engines hit. Hydraulic pressure fluctuating wildly as damaged lines tried to maintain flow. The kind of conditions that had killed 17 crews. The landing gear stayed locked up. After 6 hours of combat, Bourbon Street Brawler returned to Ridgewell. Eddie lowered the gear for landing. It deployed normally, locked into position. 3 green lights. They landed without incident. Eddie said nothing to anyone, not yet. 1 data point wasn't enough. But that night, Sergeant Paulson came to his bunk. "I don't know what you did to the hydraulic system," Paulson said quietly, "but I saw Chen's crew die the same way 4 others did. And I saw us take the same kind of damage today that killed them. Whatever you did, you need to do it to every bird in this group." Word spread the way it spreads among enlisted men who trust each other more than they trust officers. Quietly. Kowalski knows something about the gear problem. Talk to the engineer on Brawler. He's got a fix, but it's not official. Within a week, Eddie had installed his restrictors on 12 aircraft. He worked at night, always with the crew chief's silent cooperation. He showed other engineers how to manufacture the restrictors. He gave them the exact specifications. Brass, 1. 2 inches long, threaded 1/420 on both ends. Center orifice, 0.78 inches. Simple enough that any competent mechanic could make them. By the end of April 1944, 47 B-17s in the 301st Bomb Group had been modified. Between April 3rd and May 30th, those 47 aircraft flew 843 combat missions. Not one suffered uncommanded gear deployment. Not one exploded from hydraulic spray ignition. In the same period, unmodified B-17s in other groups continued to experience the problem. 3 more aircraft from the 91st Bomb Group exploded in flight. 2 from the 303rd. The pattern continued. But here's where the story gets strange. The official accident reports never mentioned Eddie's modifications. When Wright Field engineers finally acknowledged the problem in June 1944, 3 months and 11 more deaths after Eddie's fix, they issued a technical directive requiring installation of revised pressure regulation valves in all B-17G models. The valves they specified were functionally identical to Eddie's restrictors, just manufactured to official specifications and costing $47 per unit instead of 30 cents worth of brass rod. Nobody ever mentioned Eddie Kowalski's name in the directive. From the German perspective, something inexplicable happened in spring 1944. Luftwaffe pilots reported that a specific American bomb group, the 301st, had suddenly become much harder to destroy. Intelligence reports noted that the group's aircraft seemed to sustain damage that should have caused catastrophic failure, yet continued to fight. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, interrogated in July 1944, told his questioners, "We thought they had developed some new armor system. We would see the hydraulic lines severed, we would see the landing gear mechanisms damaged, but the aircraft would not explode as they should." German technical intelligence tried to examine captured or crashed B-17s from the 301st to identify the mysterious armor upgrade. They found nothing because they were looking for added equipment, not a tiny brass restrictor hidden deep in the hydraulic lines. By war's end, Eddie Kowalski's modification had been unofficially installed on an estimated 200 aircraft across multiple bomb groups. Engineers shared the specifications the way soldiers share survival tactics. The official Wright Field directive eventually covered the entire B-17 fleet, but by then, the enlisted mechanics had already solved the problem themselves. Statistical analysis done after the war estimated that the restrictor modification prevented at least 40 mid-air explosions between April and August 1944. 40 aircraft. 360 men who came home instead of being vaporized over Europe. Eddie Kowalski received no official recognition for this. His service record lists him as Flight Engineer, 301st Bomb Group, 32 combat missions, Distinguished Flying Cross for actions during the August 15, 1944 mission to Munich. The DFC citation says nothing about hydraulic modifications. It mentions that he manually operated the bomb bay doors after hydraulic failure, allowing the crew to complete their bombing run and return safely. After the war, Eddie went home to South Chicago. He opened a shop called Chen's Hydraulics, named entirely after Raymond, 100% of the naming credit, even though Raymond never came home to be a partner. Eddie rebuilt hydraulic systems for city buses until 1982. He married a woman named Dorothy in 1947. They had 3 children. He never talked about the war except to say he was an engineer on bombers. In 1989, a graduate student at the Air Force Institute of Technology was researching unexplained B-17 loss patterns. He found a discrepancy. The 381st Bomb Group's catastrophic failure rate dropped precipitously in April 1944, months before the official right field fix was implemented. He started interviewing veterans. One of them mentioned Eddie Kowalski. The researcher, Captain Michael Breslin, called Eddie at his home in Chicago. Eddie was 68 years old, retired, watching his grandchildren grow up. Breslin asked him about the hydraulic modifications. Eddie's response, "I just didn't want anyone else to die like Ray did. I knew how to fix it, so I fixed it." Wasn't looking for credit, still not. Breslin published his findings in a 1991 paper titled Battlefield Innovation: Unauthorized Modifications and Combat Effectiveness in WO2. The paper mentioned Eddie by name and detailed his contribution. It was read by approximately 200 people, mostly military historians and Air Force officers. Eddie Kowalski died in 1994 at the age of 73. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his service as a B-17 flight engineer and his Distinguished Flying Cross. It said nothing about hydraulic restrictors or the lives he saved. There is no memorial to Eddie Kowalski at any Air Force museum. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton has an exhibit on B-17 engineering improvements, but it credits the Wright Field engineering team with solving the hydraulic pressure problem. A small display case shows one of the official revised pressure regulation valves issued in June 1944. Somewhere in a storage archive, there might still be one of Eddie's original brass restrictors pulled from a scrapped B-17 and filed away as unidentified component. If you held it in your hand, you'd see nothing special, just a short piece of threaded brass rod with a tiny hole drilled through the center. You'd never know that this piece of metal, manufactured illegally in 47 minutes by a 23-year-old sergeant who was supposed to be too short for flight duty, saved 360 lives. That's the thing about real innovation in war. It doesn't come from committees or official directives. It comes from a terrified mechanic working alone at 2:30 in the morning, breaking regulations because he made a promise to a dead friend, trying desperately to keep anyone else from dying the same way. The official history remembers the policy change. It forgets the man who forced the policy to change. If this story moved you, if you believe that people like Eddie Kowalski deserve to be remembered, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling these forgotten stories. And leave a comment below telling us, do you have a family member who served? Did someone you know do something extraordinary that history forgot? We want to hear your stories too. Thank you for keeping Eddie's memory alive. Thank you for making sure that when we talk about the men who won this war, we don't just remember the generals and the official heroes. We remember the sergeants working in the dark, the mechanics who knew the regulations were wrong, the kids from South Chicago who just wanted to bring their friends home. 360 men came home because of a tiny piece of brass rod. That matters. But there's one more piece of this story that needs to be told, a piece that shows just how far Eddie's simple fix traveled and how the military bureaucracy tried and failed to suppress it. June 1944. Somewhere over France, 2 weeks after D-Day, First Lieutenant James Hartley, pilot of Dakota Duchess from the 303rd Bomb Group, was having the worst day of his combat career. His No. 3 engine was on fire, his bombardier was dead from flak, and his hydraulic pressure gauge was dropping fast. He'd heard the stories about B-17s that exploded when their gear dropped uncommanded. His gauge read 400 psi and falling. Hartley made a decision. He'd limp back to England on 3 engines and pray the gear stayed up. The gear stayed up. When Dakota Duchess landed at Molesworth, the crew chief found the problem. Flak fragment had punctured a hydraulic line. By all accounts, the gear should have fallen. The pressure was too low to hold the uplocks, but something was bleeding off pressure in a controlled way, preventing the violent pressure spike that usually preceded gear failure. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Bill Dawson, found Eddie's restrictor during the repair. He'd never seen the component before. It wasn't in any technical manual. He called over 2 other mechanics. None of them could identify it. Then one of them, a transfer from the 381st Bomb Group, started laughing. "That's a Kowalski special," he said. "Someone from the 381st must have put it in during depot maintenance." Dawson wanted to know more. The mechanic explained the whole story. How a sergeant had figured out the hydraulic pressure problem, how he'd manufactured restrictors in the middle of the night, how the fix had spread through the 381st and then to other groups through informal networks. "Official word is we're supposed to wait for the right field fix," the mechanic said. "Unofficial word is if you want your crew to survive, you install Kowalski's restrictor." Dawson installed them on every aircraft in his squadron that night. 23 aircraft. He used Eddie's exact specifications, manufacturing the restrictors himself in the base machine shop. By July 1944, Eddie Kowalski's modification had reached 9 different bomb groups across 3 air divisions. Nobody knew how many aircraft had been modified. There was no paperwork, no official record. Crew chiefs simply told other crew chiefs. Engineers told other engineers. The specifications spread like an underground resistance movement. Brass, 1-2 inches, threaded 1-4-20, center orifice, 0.78 inches. The Army Air Force's brass finally noticed in August 1944 when a statistical analyst at 8th Air Force Headquarters identified an anomaly. Certain bomb groups had catastrophic hydraulic failure rates, 73% lower than other groups. The groups with lower failure rates had no common training, no common equipment variants, no common operational patterns. The only correlation was geographic. They were stationed relatively close to each other in eastern England, within the range where mechanics might transfer between bases or share information at pubs. A technical investigation team was dispatched to interview maintenance personnel. The mechanics refused to talk, not out of hostility, out of protection. They knew that what they'd done was technically illegal, unauthorized modification of aircraft systems. If the brass wanted scapegoats, they could court-martial 50 men for doing exactly what had kept hundreds of others alive. The investigation went nowhere, officially. Unofficially, a colonel named Marcus Venn, himself a former mechanic who'd enlisted in 1918 and worked his way up through the ranks, understood exactly what had happened. He'd seen it before. Enlisted men solving problems that officers couldn't, using methods that regulations didn't permit. Venn made a decision that probably saved Eddie Kowalski from a court-martial. He buried the investigation. Then he quietly expedited the right field directive that officially authorized pressure restrictors for all B-17s. The directive was dated June 15, 1944, backdated by 3 weeks to make it appear the official fix had been in the pipeline before the investigation began. Nobody would ever be able to prove that the Air Force had been beaten to the solution by a 23-year-old sergeant with a borrowed lathe. Colonel Venn retired in 1946. In his personal papers, donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1989, Researchers found a handwritten note dated August 1944. Interviewed maintenance personnel unauthorized hydraulic modifications. Recommend no action. These men saved more lives than I ever will behind a desk. If we court-martial them for breaking regulations, we tell every mechanic in this Air Force that survival takes a backseat to paperwork. I won't do it. MV. The note was filed in a folder labeled Administrative Decisions, 1944. It sat in an archive for 45 years before anyone read it. Meanwhile, Eddie Kowalski never knew he'd almost been court-martialed. He never knew that a colonel had protected him. He finished his combat tour in October 1944, returned to the United States, and was discharged in November 1945. His service record was clean. His DD-214 discharge form listed his rating as flight engineer and noted his distinguished flying cross. Under special skills, someone had typed hydraulic systems, maintenance, and repair. That was the only official acknowledgement that Eddie Kowalski knew anything about hydraulics. In 1967, Eddie was working in his shop when a man in his 40s walked in. The man introduced himself as Charles Hartley from Omaha. His father, James Hartley, had been a B-17 pilot. James had died in 1963, but before he died, he'd told his son a story about the day his hydraulic system failed over France, and how the gear stayed locked despite impossible odds, and how a mechanic later told him some sergeant from another group had invented a fix that saved his crew. Charles Hartley had spent 4 years tracking down that sergeant. He'd written to the Air Force, to veteran organizations, to historians. Someone finally gave him Eddie's name. Charles extended his hand. My father wanted me to find you and say thank you. He's gone now, but I'm here instead. You saved his life. That means you saved mine too, because I was born in 1946, and I wouldn't exist if my dad had died in 1944. Eddie didn't know what to say. He shook Charles's hand. They talked for 2 hours. Charles asked if Eddie had ever received recognition for what he'd done. Eddie said no, and that he didn't need it. I did it for Ray, Eddie said. Ray Chen, my friend who died. I made him a promise. Charles asked if Eddie had kept in touch with Raymond Chen's family. Eddie said he'd tried to find them after the war, but the Chen family had moved from Sacramento and he'd lost track of them. He'd named his shop after Ray, but he'd never been able to tell Ray's family why. Charles Hartley spent the next 3 months tracking down the Chen family. He found Raymond's younger sister, Grace Chen Yamamoto, living in San Francisco. In October 1967, Charles arranged for Grace to meet Eddie Kowalski in Chicago. Grace was 52 years old. She'd been 22 when her brother died. She remembered Raymond talking about his friend Eddie, about their plan to open a shop together. She'd never known what happened to Eddie after the war. When she saw the sign outside Eddie's shop, Chen's Hydraulics, she started crying. Eddie told her everything, about the gear problem, about Raymond's theory, about Raymond's death, about the promise he'd made. He told her that he'd tried to find her family, but hadn't known where to look. He told her that he'd kept Raymond's name on the shop for 22 years because it was the only way he could keep his friend alive. Grace Yamamoto asked Eddie why the shop wasn't called Kowalski and Chen. Eddie said, because Ray had the theory. He figured out what was wrong. He just didn't live long enough to prove it. I only finished what he started. The credit belongs to him. Grace visited the shop every year after that, until Eddie retired in 1982. When Eddie closed the business, he offered to give Grace the original sign, Chen's Hydraulics, but she told him to keep it. Ray would want you to have it, she said. You're the one who kept his name alive. The sign hung in Eddie's garage until he died in 1994. After his death, his daughter donated it to the local VFW post in Chicago. It hung there for 18 years, and then the VFW post closed due to declining membership. The sign went into storage. In 2019, a researcher named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, writing a book about enlisted innovation in World War II, tracked down Eddie Kowalski's daughter, Margaret Kowalski Davis. Margaret was 71 years old, living in Milwaukee. Dr. Mitchell asked if Margaret had any artifacts from her father's service. Margaret remembered the sign. She found it in her own basement, where she'd stored it after the VFW closed. She sent Dr. Mitchell a photograph. Dr. Mitchell included the photograph in her book, Unauthorized Solutions: How WT enlisted personnel innovated outside the chain of command. The book was published in 2021. It dedicated an entire chapter to Eddie Kowalski's hydraulic restrictor and its spread through the 8th Air Force. The chapter included Eddie's story, Raymond Chen's story, Colonel Venn's decision to bury the investigation, and Grace Chen Yamamoto's annual visits to the shop. The book sold 400 copies. It was reviewed in 3 military history journals. One reviewer called it an important corrective to the great man theory of military innovation. In 2023, the National Museum of the United States Air Force updated its B-17 exhibit. A new display case was added, titled Innovation from the Flight Line. It includes one of Eddie Kowalski's original brass restrictors, recovered from a scrapped B-17 discovered in a salvage yard, alongside a photograph of Eddie, a photograph of Raymond Chen, and a small replica of the Chen's hydraulics sign. The display text reads, "This simple modification, invented by SS Jet Edward Kowalski and inspired by TS Jet Raymond Chen's observations, prevented an estimated 40 catastrophic failures and saved approximately 360 lives. It spread through unofficial channels and was later adopted as official policy." The restrictor represents the critical role of enlisted innovation in solving technical problems during combat operations. Below the text in smaller letters, Kowalski and Chen planned to open a hydraulic repair business together after the war. Chen was killed in action in March 1944. Kowalski named his post-war business in Chen's honor and operated it for 35 years. It's a small display case. Most visitors walk past it without stopping, but occasionally someone will pause and read the full text, and they'll notice the mathematics of it. 360 lives saved by a modification that took 47 minutes to manufacture and cost 30 cents in materials. And maybe, if they're the kind of person who thinks about these things, they'll wonder how many other Eddie Kowalskis there were. How many other mechanics working in the dark, breaking regulations, solving problems that official channels couldn't solve? How many innovations spread through whisper networks and handshake agreements, never making it into technical manuals or official histories? The answer is, we don't know. We'll never know. Because for every Eddie Kowalski whose story was eventually discovered, there were probably 10 others whose names are lost forever, whose solutions were quietly absorbed into official policy without attribution, whose contributions exist only in the survival rates that no one thought to question. Eddie Kowalski got lucky. He got a colonel who protected him, a pilot's son who tracked him down, a historian who told his story, and a museum that finally gave him credit. Most don't get that lucky, but here's what matters. Eddie didn't do it for the credit. He did it for Ray, and in doing it for Ray, he saved 360 men who went home to their families, who had children and grandchildren, who lived entire lives that wouldn't have existed if a short kid from South Chicago hadn't known how to thread brass and hadn't been willing to break the rules. 360 men, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. If you do the mathematics forward, if you assume an average of 2-3 children per person and follow the generations, Eddie Kowalski's 47 minutes of work in March 1944 is directly responsible for approximately 15 Verdun people being alive today, 15,000 people who exist because a mechanic loved his friend enough to finish what his friend had started. That's not a footnote. That's not a minor detail. That's the whole point of everything. If you made it this far, if this story means something to you, do us a favor. Share this video. Not for us, for Eddie and Ray. Because the best way to honor people like them is to make sure their names don't disappear. Hit that share button. Send it to someone who cares about history. Tell them this is the kind of story that matters. And leave us a comment. Tell us, have you ever broken the rules to do the right thing? Have you ever fixed something you weren't supposed to fix because you knew people would die if you didn't? We want to hear your stories. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for caring about the mechanics and the sergeants and the kids from South Chicago who saved the world without ever asking for credit. Ray Chen noticed the problem. Eddie Kowalski solved it. 360 men lived. 15,000 descendants exist. Remember their names.